G'day, Hugh here from videsign.com.au, a design company based on the Gold Coast in Australia, and thank you for joining me. Today I thought we'd have a look at how you can use Photoshop to create HDR images, high dynamic range, using bracketed photos. So there's photos taken with 3 different exposures. You combine them together in Photoshop and create one exposure which has a lot of detail in the highlights, in the shadows and the midtones, and it creates a dynamic range. So let's hop into Photoshop and I'll show you how to do it. So HDR or high dynamic range is a process where you can combine multiple images of varying exposures to create a final photo with a much greater tonal range than could be captured in a single shot. So it requires you to bracket your photos when you're actually taking those shots using your DSLR, and it has a bracketing feature in it which allows you to have one shot. Normally it's done with 3, so one shot that's underexposed, one that's exposed, and the other that's the third that's overexposed. And when you combine the 3, you get a combination of all 3 exposures, which creates a high dynamic range, which is why they're called HDR photos. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up a bracketed photo that I've got, and so we have got the underexposed, the exposed and the overexposed, and we're going to select all 3 and open them all up. Now they are camera raw photos, so they will open up in camera raw and allow us to do some work. Now the first thing what we can do is do some initial changes, but whatever your the one that you've got highlighted with blue will be the one that shows up on your screen. You can have all 3 selected at once, and any changes you make will affect all 3 of them. It's easiest to work off the overexposed one because it gives you the most detail that you can see. And just with this, before we merge it into a HDR image, we'll just have all three selected. I'll just get through that like so. So we've got all in grey now, which means all 3 are selected. And I think what we'll just do first, before we merge into HDR, is we'll just come along to the camera calibration, which we have got in here, or lens correction. We'll make the profile, and we'll just remove any chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections, which just allows us to because it was taken on a Canon, Photoshop knows basically the details of your lens and the processor on your DSLR, so it will make adjustments according to that. So once we've got that done, we can just have a look here. It's only very minor, but it has been a slight change there. So once again, we can select all 3, and then so all 3 are grayed. The blue tells us which one is on our screen, but all 3 are grey, which means they're all selected. Then you can just right click on them and merge to HDR. So we let that go through. It takes a little while. It's 3 photos, so it's not too difficult. It will just get it all done. Now we are in this panel, so we haven't merged yet. So we can, if we would like just to leave it as is, have auto tone selected, and it would automatically do a lot of adjustments for us. But I'm going to leave that unselected because it will allow us to make some changes that we really want to do ourselves. Now deghost, if these clouds were moving really fast, or if you had a different photo where there were maybe people or cars or something moving through the bracketed photos, because that takes 3 photos according to the light and whatnot. It could be every couple of seconds, even if they're the overexposed one. So that could create ghosts where the object or person or car or what have you is moving through the frame. You can deghost and low, medium, high. Same with the clouds if they're moving. But in this case, we don't really need to do that because there's minimal movement. So with all that selected, we can just click on merge, and then we can just save this to tutorial 14, so we'll call it tutorial 14, and we'll save it as a DNG, digital negative, which is what we want, and it will create a fourth photo down here, and we just let that go through. We'll get there eventually, and there we have it. So this is our combination of 1, 2, and 3 is itself a third photo or fourth photo, which we can now edit. So now that we've got that, I think we just do our basic normal editing, because we have all that information there available to play with, and we can do a few different adjustments. So like we can come to basic, so that the basic one, so I was in camera calibration from when we fixed up the lens profile of these original 3 photos. I just come across here to basic, and we can just do a little bit of work on different elements of the photo. So we can bring down the highlights, which I always like to do, and that immediately improves the sky. And open up the shadows, and we get a lot more detail in these underexposed areas. Another thing I like to do a little bit of work with is the whites and blacks. I'm going to hold the Alt key down, open up the whites till we see a little bit of red appear, and same with the blacks till we see a little bit of black appear. Then we boost the clarity, the vibrance, and add a little bit of saturation to it as well to give it a bit of color. Now we've always got the before and after toggle we got down here to see where we're coming from and where we're going to. So there's a big difference between just the original photo and where we are now, just with a few simple adjustments. Now what we have got here next is to have a look at probably the sky, and we can just create a little bit more drama in the sky by using the graduated filter, and we can take it down from the top corner at a slight angle down to sort of the horizon. You don't want it to be too angled, but maybe just down to just above the sun. Now things we can do with this is we can bring the exposure down a bit, and the temperature, make it a little bit bluer to give us a bit of a look there. And we can also play around with a few other elements, like maybe just increasing the highlights a little bit, and maybe work on a bit of the clarity as well in the clouds there. So you can see if we start there and go all the way up there, there's quite a big clarity difference. I think we'll just we'll boost the clarity a bit, but not too much, and create a little bit of noise and that sort of stuff if you go too far on that. And just with that, dehaze, just dehaze it a bit too. Okay, so that's the graduated filter. When we click on the hand, I always just click on the hand to get out of the filter and move back to starting our next one. So I think what we'll do is we'll add a radial filter to work on the sky here, and we can just make it about that sort of size, just sort of around where the sun is sort of radiating out, and get the center to be around where the sun is. Now we want to make sure it's inside, because if it's outside, everything outside this radial filter is affected. If it's inside, it's everything inside the radial filter that's affected, and that's what we want to work on. We want to work on the sun just appearing a bit warmer, so we just bump up the temperature there. You don't want to overdo it, just enough to really create a nice effect with the sun. Probably just add. Actually, what we'll do is we'll just click on the plus here for temperature, so it resets everything, because it remembers everything from your previous usage. So I don't think we'll go that far with the temperature, but everything else is now at 0, because I've just isolated the temperature. So we'll just do the temperature to begin with, warm that up a little, and then just increase the exposure a little bit on the sun there. And then with, I think we'll also maybe just add a little bit to the highlights, like so, and just add a little bit back to the whites as well. So you can see there that if we click here, can show us the difference between the two. So that's without the radial filter, and that's with the radial filter. So you don't want to go crazy, but you still want to give that a little bit more effect there. So again, click the hand to get out of the filter, and we can compare before and after. Starting to look really good now. Okay. Now that we've done that with the sun, I like to do a little bit of a vignette. In this case, we'll probably go with best way to do it would be with the lens correction, and in the manual one. And here you got vignetting, so you just pump up the vignette, and so make that probably around minus 30 or thereabouts. Probably a little bit too strong. It's 39, so about minus 30, and the midpoint we'll bump that down to around 20-ish. You can see if we go all the way down, it's a bit too strong, so maybe around that 20 mark looks good. Yeah, so that gives us a bit of focus on this sort of section of the photo, which is nice. Now this is optional, you don't have to do this, but I like to work a little bit with the split toning, which is this button here. So if you click on split toning, you can pump up the highlights to really create the orange, and the shadows into the sort of the tealy, sort of more blue, darker. I think in a photo like this you need the blues to be bluer, but that's all personal taste. Whatever you think looks nice. And again, we can just look at the difference between it before and after. So we probably bring the blues back a bit, or even push the balance more to the orange rather than blue. But I think just with that, it gives it a real point of difference, because you look at the sky, you add that in. Now, okay, that might have washed it out of it, so I think we bring the blues back just a tad, and the hue, the orange, the highlights a little bit. So yeah, it's personal preference. On or off, look, I don't mind. I think on, it gives a bit of contrast between the blue and the orange. You play around with that and see what you like. I'm not totally sold on that, but I don't mind it too much. So the last thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom in on this sort of the horizon area here, and you can see here, and it's always going to be the case, you take a photo and the stuff in the distance, landscape photos in the distance, is always hazy. So we'll come up here with a brush, and we'll obviously go new, and what we'll do is we'll go dehaze. I'll click that, it defaults to plus 25, so we'll keep the brush around this sort of size. It's good for this sort of photo, but what we want to do is we want to remove that haze from the background of the photo, the distance, the hills in the distance. So we just take that haze out, and we just really bring that down a fair bit there. And dehaze works really well in Camera Raw, because when you take photos and the sun is out and it's difficult to see into the distance because of the haze, this really reduces that haze. Now we've also got a bit of haze here, so what we can do is we just can come back to here, click on it, which allows us to then further just work on the back section here, and pretty much be done. So we'll come back down to the zoom, fit in view, and that's pretty much our finished product. So that's a HDR image. It's 3 images combined into one, and then edited to create a really dynamic looking photo with a lot of detail. There is not, you're not losing detail in the shadows, and you're not losing detail in the highlights because of the overexposure or underexposure. You've got a very good amount of detail across the entire picture. Now there are other ways of doing this, and this is just one. So I think I might have a look at some other software in a future tutorial which allows you to do similar things, combining three photos that are bracketed, exposures, and can create a very cool looking HDR image. So until then, I'll see you later.